This is Chapter 11, Key Issues 3 and 4, and we're focusing on global trade, which can be a little complicated. It is economics after all, so try to keep up, take good notes, and and make sure you bring questions to class if something was confusing, okay? All right, so this is the global economy in 2016. So you don't need to memorize all of this. It's just, I want you to see just how complex the trade networks are, okay? So the U.S. trades with all of these different countries, right? And China is a big one as well. I just want you to kind of see like the different, like, relationships, I should call them, not roots, because they're not like actual roots, but relationships there are. So basically, when we say global economy, we really mean global economy. Like everybody is involved in the world economy, okay? All right, so when you have this kind of relationship, it means that countries are going to depend on each other as part of their own economic strength, right? If the U.S. didn't trade with other countries, our economy would be a lot weaker, right? Our GNI would probably be a lot lower. Our GDP would be a lot lower. So the good thing about being part of the world economy is that it can boost your economy. It can be really good for your economy. However, there are some drawbacks to having such an interconnected economy. So economic interdependence is what we are talking about, right? So countries can't really survive without their trade relationships. Or, as in 2008, when we had a global financial crisis that started in the US, but it hit everywhere. So even if countries that maybe weren't directly involved in the economic crisis, they felt their economies decline just because their big trading partners like the US and European countries, their economies went down, so they were less willing to trade because they couldn't afford a lot of trade, right? So it ended like, it was like a domino crisis that happened all over the world. This just shows you, this is 2008. So this is the value, this is the EU areas, and the United States GDP tanked, right, in 2008. And that affected everybody because the core countries, right, dependency theory, the semi-periphery and the periphery can't survive without the core. And if the core tanks, so does everybody else, okay? Something else that is happening is outsourcing, which you've probably heard of. It just means when core countries move their manufacturing to probably semi-periphery or periphery countries because the cheap labor, right? Americans know that they don't have to pay people in Bangladesh as much as Americans. Americans won't work for that little, and we have, like, you know, pesky things like minimum wage laws and things like that that are not easy to get around. So it's been really controversial, outsourcing. On the one hand, it's helpful to countries that gain these new businesses. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about the maquiladoras in Mexico that do a lot of U.S. manufacturing. So it's helped their economies, but it means that we lose that secondary economic sector. Okay, like we lose those jobs. So oftentimes it's cheaper for the manufacturer, so it's good for the person in business, but it's not good for the employees, typically, of the United States. And we're not the only country that does outsourcing. Lots of core countries do outsourcing. I'm just using the U.S. as an example, okay? This also means that there's a lot more connectivity between the countries, right? Your headquarters might be in the States, but then your manufacturing might be in another country. That's a very close relationship then that country, those two countries have economically. Can you not? Thank you. Sorry. Okay. This is just another look at Wallerstein showing you So like how this looks with the division of labor. So again, your semi-periphery and your periphery countries are going to do a lot of the manufacturing. And I would say, hey, semi-periphery more than anything else. So those purple countries, those are your big manufacturing countries. Your periphery countries are your big agriculture, like subsistence agriculture countries, right? Bangladesh, however, would be a different. India is kind of a mixed bag. I would almost call India is kind of both a periphery and semi-periphery country. It kind of depends on where you're talking about. There's a lot of agriculture that still happens in India, but there's a lot of manufacturing too. So China's the same way. I would call those both like purpley red countries. Okay, it also means that energy consumption is going to get distributed throughout the world, right? So this is showing you that the darkest red countries are the ones with the highest energy consumption by person. And for the most part, it's your core countries, right? The red would be the next highest. Saudi Arabia, interestingly enough, that's where the most oil reserves are, though, so that could be why they burn so much energy at the same time, right? So that also shows you sub-Saharan Africa does not use a lot of energy, and it's because they don't have the resources to use a lot of energy, right? So that is also an interesting thing to think about. Okay, and I want to talk a second about women in the secondary labor force and that secondary economic sector. This shows you the highest participators in the workforce in secondary, and you will notice that there is a lot in these periphery and semi-periphery countries. Okay, so women work in manufacturing all over the world, basically, which sounds great, right? Like, it's the secondary economic sector that's more probably substantial than the primary economic sector, unless you're like a big-time farmer, which in these countries you wouldn't be. But there's all these things that come with having this many women in the labor force when it comes to manufacturing. So they make up a large part of the workforce, both in core and semi-periphery countries. A little less so in periphery countries, but they're definitely there. They receive lower wages. So as much as we would like to say, oh, this is great for female empowerment, well, the reason they want women working is because they know they can pay less than men, right? So they don't have to pay a woman as much as a man because that's culturally acceptable, okay? Happens in core countries too, by the way. So they are also offered different types of work than men get. A man might be offered the job of running a factory, but a woman isn't going to be offered that job. Okay, she's going to be like these women in the picture. She's going to be on the lines doing the work. Okay. And overwork of women, mistreatment of women in the workplace, especially in these semi-periphery nations, is really, really common, unfortunately. Okay, so the other way that we have, Teddy, economic interdependence is with these trade blocs, okay? So what I mean by a trade bloc is like a network of countries that have a trade agreement together. The EU would be an example of a trade bloc, right? Because they have no tariffs, which means free trade amongst all EU member nations. Another one to talk about that we haven't really discussed before is NAFTA. That's the North American Free Trade Agreement. So basically, we have a euro system, sort of, as well, without the currency. So Canada, Mexico, and the United States also have free trade amongst the three countries, okay? This is kind of, there's been a lot of talk of revisiting NAFTA. The president has even talked about taking NAFTA away completely. So that's all kind of up in the air. But for now, there is still a NAFTA, and we are still a large participator in NAFTA. So these are good because they can help grow the economies of member states. When we had that discussion about the EU, that was a positive thing that you guys brought up, that for most countries, it has increased their GDP. Hasn't happened for everybody, but for lots of countries, it has helped increase their GDP. I would say it has definitely helped Mexico do so. We're going to have a discussion on how much NAFTA has helped Mexico, but we're going to do that next week. So the successes of these organizations can sometimes be debatable. It has also meant that we have outsourced a lot of our manufacturing to Mexico, which has been kind of a negative for Americans. So they're kind of, they have positives and negatives. Okay, and then governments can also do things to help economic development or hinder, but they would never mean to do that. But they can do things to help grow economies. So one thing they can do is a stimulus package. So stimulus packages are when the government gives individuals and sometimes companies money, and the hope is that people will spend that money, because that's what helps economies grow, is the spending, the buying and selling of goods. You want your economy to be really active, okay? Active economies are a sign of a good, healthy economy. So that's one thing that they will do. This happened in 2008, by the way. Stimulus packages were given to individuals. Companies were bailed out. These companies that went belly up and bankrupt were bailed out. One example would be GM Motors. The government knew that if GM went under, all of these people were going to be unemployed. It was going to be bad for U.S. markets, so they bailed out the government gave them money so that they could get out of bankruptcy. And I think it's my understanding that GM has already paid them back and they're doing much better, so that worked out pretty well, I think. Austerity is when governments decide to cut government spending in order to conserve funds. So they'll say, like, okay, they might talk about cutting Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid. Those are usually unpopular things to cut, but it is discussed at times. Oftentimes what gets cut is infrastructure spending, like, okay, well, maybe we're not going to build that road that we were going to build because we are trying to tighten our belts, right? Conserve money. So that's called austerity. Something else that governments can do is they can reduce tariffs. That can help promote economic development. The president just decided to increase tariffs on steel and aluminum. So we'll have to see what happens there. I know that a lot of other countries around the world are now thinking of increasing tariffs on products that they buy from the U.S., like Harley-Davidson products and Levi Strauss. And so that'll be something to watch out for over the next couple of weeks. And then governments can also create jobs through the production of infrastructure. A good example, I don't know if you remember learning this in middle school, was with FDR during the Great Depression. One of the ways we got out of the Depression, besides the war, was that he created the New Deal, which basically was a lot of jobs, government jobs, they were building roads and building dams. The Hoover Dam in Vegas is a New Deal project. So they were putting people to work by creating those jobs. So that's something else that governments can do. So governments have a lot of pull over, I would say they can't control, they're not there to control the economy, but there's lots of measures that governments can take when economies start to shrink, okay? So there's things that they can do to help the economy grow. All right. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is ecotourism. This is another thing that is not in your book. This is something that has become really popular in semi-periphery and some periphery countries. Ecotourism is where countries utilize their natural habitats to attract tourism, okay? So Costa Rica has done this really well. Like, what do you think of when you go to Costa Rica? You think of ziplining through all the beautiful lush jungles and things like that, right? And their beautiful beaches. Well, that attracts tourism. And it's great for periphery and semi-periphery countries because it's using things that they already have. They don't have to build a giant Disneyland theme park. They can just use